Hello, everyone. In just 2 hours, the atomic rocket will take off on its flight to the moon, circumnavigating it on its journey, and then returning to this Earth, thus achieving the most ambitious scientific adventure of all time. 25 monitoring stations throughout the world in direct communication with the base here will follow the course of XC by means of radar installed in artificial satellites that have been launched into space at intervals during the last few years. The name of the pilot is not yet known. It is being kept secret till the last moment. There are 3 men who are eligible for this coveted task. From Russia, England, and America, which of them will be first to attempt, in the immortal words of Shakespeare, full soon to draw the cloud that hides the silver moon?
That they may not move from the enclosure allotted to them.
Attention, attention! Viewers, I was handed only a moment ago the pilot's name. The first man to be launched into space is the American John McLaren.
Hi everybody, and welcome to our first proper episode of our first season of Wild Wild Podcast. I'm calling this season Italiani nello spazio, or Italians in Space. And I would like to welcome our co-host to the show, Rod Barnett. Hi Rod.
Hey Adrian, how are you doing?
Yeah, good. My problem at the moment is having too many films to watch for too many different projects. Something I'm sure you can relate to.
Yes, I can. I'm contemplating another project as we speak, and to do so is going to require me to spend a little time watching Zorro movies. So I'm kind of wondering if I'm going to do that or not. Not that I don't like Zorro movies. It's just that's a major detour if I go do that. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's only so much time in the world to fit all this stuff in, but it's difficult to say no when things are so fun. But so what we're doing then with this season, I've picked out 10 films that cover a time period of roughly 20 years and it's kind of the genesis of the Italian space science fiction film, which is what we're going to cover today, all the way through to the sort of tail end when the films became known as Star Wars knockoffs, which is perhaps a little unfair, but we can decide on that when we get there. But anyway, so today we're going to talk about the day the sky exploded, or La morte viene dallo spazio, the direct translation of which is Death Comes from Outer Space, which is incidentally what it was released as in the UK.
I love that title, by the way. Death Comes from Outer Space. It's both descriptive and accurate. Yeah.
And a bit more threatening.
Yes.
The day the sky exploded appears to be the US title that it was given when it was released over there. So this film was technically directed by Mario Bava. It's kind of listed as being his first full feature film that he directed, but his name was not in the credits as the director. The official director was Paolo Heusch, but it would appear that he just allowed his name to be used to get the funding, but he actually was happy for Mario Bava to have a go. And so this is a Bava film with Bava special effects as well, which I'm sure we'll talk about as we go through. So Rod, was this a film that you were familiar with? I know you're a Bava fan.
Well, I was aware of the title, and I was aware that the film existed, but strangely enough, because of the title's similarity to another science fiction film that has nothing to do with this, I had been laboring under the complete misapprehension for years that I had seen this movie, and I had not. And I only discovered this a few weeks ago when I was looking at the trailer for this movie and realized that nothing looked familiar. So this is essentially a new view for me. I've never seen this movie before until just recently. Now, having watched it a couple of times, I can say it's good that this is not known as Mario Bava's feature debut as a director, because I much prefer I much prefer going and saying, it was Black Sunday. Let's just say let's go with that, and everybody could be happier, because there's precious little of what I think Bava fans love and adore about him that you're going to find in this picture.
What the feeling that I got when I was watching the film, we'll go through the plot in a minute, but this reminded me of Ed Wood, not because it's a bad film, but because it's basically a stock footage film.
Yeah.
And there's that great moment in the movie of Ed Wood where he's looking at all of this sort of footage at a film studio, and he says, if I had all this footage, I'd make a movie, it'd be great, And it feels like that's what happened here, that they had all of this stock footage around, and then they just tasked somebody to come up with a story that meant they could use this stock footage to make about 50% of the running time or whatever it is, and then they would shoot some stuff in a tiny studio to fill in all the gaps. It definitely feels like that, but I think that's great. I mean, it's kind of impressive that they were able to piece a story together from all of this disparate footage that's it's probably in different aspect ratios and different film stocks from different times, and they've pieced it all together to make a story. So I suppose, although this is Mario Bava's feature debut, he only directed about half of it anyway, because the other half was pre-existing footage.
I know, and that is so odd when it's completely true that well over half of the film footage that you see in this picture, I mean, it's a short enough movie in the first place, so what is it, about 82 minutes? And well over 40 minutes of that really is stock footage. It's bizarre. I mean, it's a great way to be able to save money on a budget, and I'm sure you're right that the impetus to do this was probably, hey man, we can do this on the cheap because we have so much footage of rockets taking off and all these different things, and the amount of special effects we'll actually have to piece together can be done actually using the stock footage. It's kind of amazing when you think about the amount of creativity that goes into something like this, and just it's done not because people are striving to be creative, but because they're striving to get something done when they don't have any cash.
Yeah, and the stock footage nature of it was not lost upon reviewers. I did discover that, like I said, this film was released in the UK as Death Comes from Outer Space. Although it came out in Italy in 1958, it wasn't actually here until 1961. And the review says, faced with a small budget, this is the Monthly Film Bulletin review, faced with a small budget and an extremely elaborate subject, the producers of this Franco-Italian science fiction film have turned to stock footage to such an extent that this might well be termed the stock shot film par excellence. So they're kind of praising its use of the stock footage. So often you would sort of dismiss a film as using loads of stock footage and it's a bit rubbish, but here they're kind of saying it's a plus. You can sort of admire what they've done with it, which I think is great.
Yeah, and I certainly do, because the amount of stock footage being so much of the movie, and then the other elements where when you start to parse what's actually been created specifically to create this movie, when you look at the footage that is unique to the movie, you begin to realize also that they may have only had one set and then just redressed it a few times to do various scenes within it. The poverty on display is kind of matched by the level of creativity used to make it look like something bigger than it is.
Yeah, the reviewer says, in fairness, it should be added that this disparate material has been quite ingeniously assembled. So, props to the editor for making all this stuff work. It's and I'm sure Bava was also involved in the editing and piecing all this thing together.
Well, I'm sure he was definitely involved in a lot of the neat use of of glass mat shots that enhance some of the rocket footage. So he would have to have been involved in the editing, one would assume. Yeah.
Yes, because you see, so the special effects sequences are where, which is where we perhaps would know Bava best at this point in his career. People were bringing him in as a special effects expert, and he was the guy to go to at this point. Nobody else was really doing this stuff yet. So we've got rocket shots, we've got I don't know what those things are, like big halos in the sky over the cities. We've got all kinds of stuff that's going on, and if you read the Bava book by Tim Lucas, he talks about the way in which some of these special effects were being done, and it was just really simple stuff like projecting a picture on a sheet and then waving a light around behind it and then filming that. Like really simple stuff. So Bava was a genius, as we know, at creating special effects on a very low budget, and it's great to see an early example of that. It's only a real shame here that the only available print at the moment of this film, because it's not officially available anywhere. It seems to have fallen through various copyright cracks. So the only version of the film that you can see is quite soft, and it would be nice to be able to appreciate those special effects in slightly more higher definition.
Yeah, I fear that it would take a leap of faith on anybody who would spend the money to obtain as good a print as possible and pretty it up for video release. Essentially, because I don't know that anybody would believe that they would get a real return on their dollar, or a return on their lira, or whatever whatever it might take. Because
it would need to be part of a box set or something, I guess.
Yes, it would. And it's like, I agree with you. I would love to be able to watch this in a much more crisp, kind of high definition version, just to be able to get a really good look at some of the. I hate to say this, but just to get a better look at the seams, where the stitching is viewable, so to say, about how they did what they did. It's, in other words, more out of curiosity than out of fascination, I guess.
Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about the story. And it's quite interesting that Roger Corman was making a film with a similar plot at the same time, because this is one of those ripped from the headlines type films, where they're basing it, they're making a film about what is happening right now, and it's all about satellites and space exploration, which was obviously big news in the late 1950s. And what I think is great with this one is that they've got Americans and Russians and another guy who I think may have been German, but there's a few different countries and they're all working together like it's a kind of arms around the world type collaboration. There's no suggestion in this film that there's a Cold War. They're all just happily working together. And I
know it's oddly utopian in that we have almost every European country represented. The whole film is supposedly taking place in Australia. There are participants around the globe who are helping to track the rocket once it gets into Earth orbit. So we get representatives from several different nations in quote unquote involved in the story, and it's very odd that the idea of just completely ignoring the political tensions that existed in the world when the film was made, as if in just a couple of years, because they're not setting this in the far future, they're setting this at most a couple or 3 years from the time the film is being made. And it's like I applaud their their view of the world as having come together for this kind of huge scale human project. But there's also that part of me nagging in the back of my head that thinks that one of the reasons they might have opted for this kind of multinational view of the space race, as it were, is to make it more palatable to sell the film in lots of different countries around the world.
Yeah, true. There's certainly, although they're sort of passing it off as as an American film. And everyone, it was clearly shot with English in mind. All the signs on the walls and everything are all in English. Yeah, there's none of that sort of Cold War paranoia that is more familiar with science fiction films of this period. And obviously, so Roger Corman's film War of the Satellites was being made around the same time. And is that a film that you're familiar with, War of the Satellites?
Yes. I've watched it a couple of times, and most impressive for being the only starring role for Dick Miller. Usually he's a supporting player, and he's actually quite good. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting little movie.
And how would you say that compares to this one in terms of the kind of Cold War angle?
I don't remember the Cold War angle within the film. I do remember thinking that it was not a great movie, but okay, which puts it, I hate to say it, but kind of puts it on par with this one. Not to go ahead and throw my own opinion out there about the film as it stands, but it's an impressive feat. War of the Satellites, it leans heavily on some of the same things that this does, which I'm sure we'll get into, which is the tangled interpersonal relationships within the crew members, as it were.
Yeah, and that does seem to be something that you see, especially in a lot of American sci-fi of that period. That there has to, even if they're all in space and the world is under threat, there has to be a love interest, and there has to be a woman, and who's probably a tough scientist, but she'll fall in love with the guy by the end. All of that. And this film, it seems like in its attempts to be as American as possible, is quite happily going down that road. Shall we go through the plot?
Sure.
And then if you want to stop me at any point, then we can do that. So I'm using Tim Lucas's plot summary here, because it's quite detailed. Even though I know all the films we're talking about are really old, but I don't think I'm going to completely spoil the end. Although, you can guess what the end is going to be. But because these films are not so well known, then anyone listening might want to go out and actually watch it. So I won't go all the way to the end. But anyway, so in response to Russia's 1957 launching of the Sputnik satellite, the world's first manned spaceflight is quickly mounted at Cape Shark. So that's quite impressive. We've gone from as we know, in the real space race and the war of the satellites that was really going on, the Russians did get there first, but it wasn't like America was then able to just say, okay, we'll stick a guy up in space to get our own back. It took a long time. But here it's pretty quick. From a pool of candidates from different world countries, American pilot John McLaren, that's a good, strong American name, is chosen to become the first man in space.
Let's take a quick pause to point out how bizarre it is that no one knows who's actually getting in the rocket to go up into space to make this first manned space flight until some bizarre decision or lottery or whatever takes place mere minutes before the damn takeoff. This is not realistic, people. Come on.
He doesn't need to do any training or
did they make everyone do the same training, and then you have all these people who went through pure hell training for something like this who lose by because someone rolled the wrong die? I mean,
I know that does happen to a certain degree in real space stuff. The Russians did that, and NASA did that, I think, where they wouldn't necessarily, the choice as to who was doing what would be relatively late, but certainly not 5 minutes before the rocket goes up.
I know.
So the object of his 6-day mission is to orbit the moon, while attended by 25 monitoring stations around the world, which is, like you said, we get to that bit later where we get to see all these different places. So he's going to go up for 6 days to go around the moon. That seems like nothing could possibly go wrong.
No.
With that.
Smooth sailing.
And it's an atomic rocket, if I'm right in remembering that. Which obviously, the first rockets were not atomic, but that ties nicely in with all of the other atomic stuff that people were frightened of in the 1950s. So it's a good way of bringing these two things together into one film.
Yeah, and it's a good thing to set the scene just a little bit to realize that in 1958, the vast majority of American science fiction movies that have been produced for that particular decade had insisted that radioactivity and atomic power were going to get out of control and make insects and animals really big. So doom is just around the corner anytime anyone in a science fiction movie brings up atomic power or radiation or anything that even smacks slightly of that subject. So, we're on a doomed trajectory from the beginning.
Yeah, it's not going to end well whenever that is a plot device. So after a tearful separation from his wife Mary and his young son Dennis, and Dennis has a dog, or does the dog belong to the? I think the dog might belong to the base.
Yeah, I don't know. The dog seems to hang out. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a relationship there between the boy and his dog, which is, no pun intended, another nuclear-influenced movie from a few years later. And the dog's name is Geiger, which I thought was a nice gag.
Yeah, but isn't this a little early for that to be? Well, no, I guess not. I know. I realize what you're saying, which is the whole Geiger counter idea and the whole radiation thing. I wonder if it's a subjective thing. In other words, are they essentially just is it another little thing to make the audience aware? Oh, remember, there's radiation around.
Yeah, just because they can keep shouting Geiger, Geiger, come back, Geiger, and stuff, which is pretty funny. So after saying his tearful goodbyes, and then I think so his wife, she's had enough of being in the desert. She's had enough of her husband and everything. Oh no, wait, no, that's later. I'm getting ahead of myself. No, so at this point she's all supportive, and so he gets in the rocket, and it's an XZ rocket, apparently, and he blasts off. However, it doesn't last very long. It certainly doesn't last 6 days. After exiting the Earth's atmosphere, something strange occurs inside John's capsule. Unknown forces interfere with the astronaut's consciousness, and he does start to act very strangely at this point. His delivery is very stilted, and I wasn't sure if that was because of this strange force, or is it supposed to represent what weightlessness does to your motor functions? But he was acting really weird, or I was starting to think, is this going to be something like Quatermass Experiment? Is he becoming possessed by something in space? But he starts to act really weird. I have
to say, yeah, he acts quite robotic during the flight sequences, when we're just essentially seeing him from the chest up, and it's all this technobabble gobbledygook. But at the same time, I have to admit that up to that point in the film, his performance when he was interacting with his wife in the first parts of the movie were, I gotta say, they were so stilted and bizarre in their the way he's holding himself and the way he's delivering the dialogue, and how little facial movement, and even it's strange to notice his neck movement. I started to wonder, is this guy a robot? Is he? Are we being set up for a reveal later in the movie where it turns out that he's been taken over by an alien, or that he's actually a robot instead of a human being? Is this going to be some kind of Twilight Zone type reveal later in the story? And it's like, true. And it was so like I say, not having seen the film before, that's what I'm wondering about. And when it turns out that no, he was just an incredibly stiff performer right then, for whatever reason, it was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah, this is we should say this is Paul Hubschmid, who is a Swiss actor who's
I tricked you
into
loads
saying of European films. Yeah, thank you. He's in loads of European films, but he's also in Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, which is quite fun. By a few years before this one, but his performance is pretty stiff in these opening scenes. But and then he just seems to have something's happened in his brain. But anyway, so they lose control at this point. He loses control, and they lose contact with him from the ground, and they're advising him to abort or eject. But then it turns out that he just does that on his own anyway, and I'm not quite sure what he's ejecting into. Does he have a little escape
the
pod?
capsule? They get across the idea during the space flight that if he runs into trouble, if there's some kind of problem with the atomic engine, the part of the ship he's in can be he can eject it away from the part of the rocket that actually contains the engine, and that is what he ends up having to do.
This is what he does, but unfortunately he forgets to turn the atomic engine off before he ejects. And when he gets to the ground and they've talked to him and they say, "You did turn that off, right?" And he said, "Oh, I thought you turned it off." It's like having a conversation with your wife about whether you've left the gas on. And like, no, I said you should turn that off.
Well, then he really quickly covers and says, "Well, I tried, but the controls weren't working." It's like, we have no way to verify that, so I'm not sure if I trust you American.
They're like, "Didn't you hear us telling you to turn it off?" And, "Oh no, couldn't hear anything." So now we've got our peril, and so, but this is also the end of any stuff where we're seeing Italians in space. This is my sort of tenuous connection between these films. So the space scenes are over in the first act. He's back on the ground again, and now what we're left with is a people in a room shouting at each other film, trying to decide what to do, because he's now basically left an atomic bomb, armed and primed, in space, and something bad could happen, right? But maybe things will probably be fine. And then this is where then he starts arguing with his wife because she wants to go home to America. He is dedicated to his job, so she's like, "Oh, I'm off." So she goes off to the airport with Dennis, and he then discovers that this is what happens when you leave an atomic bomb floating around in the atmosphere. Shortly after John's successful return to Earth, the rocket has exploded in a belt of asteroids, fusing them together into one great mass that is now hurtling towards planet Earth. Now we get shots,
which sounds bad on its face. Let's be honest, yeah.
And we do get shots of the fused meteorites kind of drifting slowly towards the Earth, and that bit's perhaps not the best special effect in the film.
No, it's effective at getting across what they're trying to do, but I agree.
It doesn't look great. But top marks for trying. Mario, is what I can say. So this is now a problem, and this plot suddenly becomes something that we're all familiar with. Meteorites, out of control, heading towards the Earth. They even give us a nice close-up in the film of the Tunguska crater, which is a sort of famous meteorite that hit this forest in Russia back in the 1910s.
Yeah,
and it was like the biggest
explosion century.
Yeah, the biggest explosion ever felt on Earth before nuclear bombs, and so they're kind of reminding us of the peril of what's going to happen if this thing reaches Earth. And so that then made me think that obviously those films like Armageddon and Meteor and all these other things, either they've all seen this film and just ripped it off, or this was already a bit of a science fiction staple and that's probably been around for a while, and this wasn't the first film to do that. But I don't really know. But it's such a familiar story, it's hard to know where it came from.
Well, if you're talking about the basic story of this film, this had been done in pulp fiction many times already. If you read if you have any desire to read science fiction published in pulp magazines in the United States, or hell, even in Europe, to be honest, you were going to run across a variation on this kind of story. Once or twice a year, regardless of how effectively the editors of the magazines tried to not include such similar stories, because it's pretty standard idea. By that time, the public was well enough aware of the danger of meteorites falling to Earth and how dangerous it could be. I think at that point we even had the pretty pretty well based theory about the end of the dinosaurs being caused by a massive meteor strike, and how that could factor into this kind of thing. So yeah, it's a story idea that was floating around out there for a very long time, often used, and one could say that this is not going to be the first time we encounter this particular idea on this podcast.
No, or even this week. Yeah. Also, I forgot to mention, so we've got all this drama going on, so now we know what's going to happen. But meanwhile, we're getting human relationship interaction down on Earth. So we've got John and his wife, and she luckily at the last minute decided not to get on the plane. So she's going to come back, and he's going to be reunited with her, and they can apologize to each other. There's also
you say luckily. Are you sure about that?
Well, yeah.
I mean, because do we need this much time in a supposed science fiction film taken up by a wife essentially complaining about her husband, which is, I mean, this is, like, don't get me wrong, I guess you've got to fill 82 minutes somehow, but man.
Yeah, they didn't have any stock footage they could put in at that point, so they needed a bit more of that. But there's also some other human interest drama going on with it. There's a scientist or a mathematician called Katie, I think her name is, and she's seen as being a bit frigid, a bit cold. All she's interested in is the calculations, and if the temperature is wrong in her calculator room, then it can affect the calculations. And she's obsessed with making all these calculations. And there's another scientist there who's made a bet that he's going to get off with her by the end of the film, basically.
In other words,
then he does in about 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, that's just it. I mean, it's just as sexist as it sounds, people. I mean, if you're thinking 1958 gender stereotypes, you're there. I mean, it couldn't be more obvious that, you know, there are two female characters in the entire movie. One is a wife who does nothing but complain about her husband's dedication to his job, and a coldly, I mean, a sympathetic, don't get me wrong, but a female scientist who's in charge of the gigantic computer they use to calculate all the things that they need to calculate to make the rockets do what they need to do. And she is, she's painted as this frigid woman who, you know, probably is pretty attractive, but we'll never know because, you know, she's hiding behind those glasses. And who could see past those to see any inherent beauty in this woman's face? It's complete. It's exactly the cliches that you would expect, and I would struggle to discern whether or not in 1958 this was considered quite the cliche that, looking back, you know, 60 some odd years later, we know it to be. But at the same time, it's. Let's ask this question just out loud. What did you think of the romantic subplot here between Katie, the female scientist, and was it Doctor? His name is Peter, Dr. Leduc. He's. I mean, the thing is, I mean, he does a jerky thing by claiming that he's gonna make sure that in the next few days he's gonna be able to kiss her. But at the same time, the way he woos her, and the fact that he does seem to actually hold some real warm feelings toward her. He has some great lines of dialogue, at least in the English dub, where he's attempting to woo her and to gain her affections, not knowing that she's overheard him by accident saying that he's gonna essentially he's gonna conquer this woman. It's it's I want to hate it, but it's actually not too bad, you know?
Yeah. I think he comes across as just being a bit of a douche at the beginning, whereas she, rather than being the kind of cold, frigid character, we sympathize with her because we know that she knows he's a douche. But at the same time, as they're facing the end of the world together, you know, then there's a kind of thawing. If there is a Cold War in this film, you could argue it's between them two. And
well put,
it kind of does thaw. I mean, she does let him kiss her, even though she knows. And then she's cross with him because she says, you've won your bet now. And he's all embarrassed because he didn't know that she knew. But it seems to be eventually kind of all is forgiven because she's good at her job, he's good at his job. Together they're going to make this computer save the world. So yeah, it pans out better than it could have done at the beginning.
True.
But I think there's no argument that she's a much better human being than he is, and that she could probably do better.
Yes, I agree.
But she's in the desert in the middle of Australia, so she hasn't got a lot of choice. Yeah, and all the other men are married or much older,
or koala bears. So yeah.
Yeah, or not that the men being much older ever usually is a problem in a film.
Especially not films made at this time where it's
no, but that's a story for another day. So here we go. So we've got initially there are reported problems. They're picking up problems with the Earth's magnetism, if I'm right. Like the magnetic field of the Earth is starting to change, and we know that because animals of all kinds, wild and domestic, including Geiger, begin to run in migratory packs. And this is where we get some brilliant stock footage of animals legging it. And the idea is that they're all running away from the coastal regions around the world. All the animals are fleeing inland because they know that there's some major tsunamis about to come. So that's the first sign that things are going wrong here. And even though I think somebody says in the film that this hasn't been picked up on our instruments, and Katie says, but animals are much more sensitive than our instruments.
This has to be the moment where you had your first inkling that this was very Ed Woodian in its construction. The idea, because it's clear every bit of this footage is nothing but stock footage, and it's you already knew that some of the rocket footage earlier in the picture had to be that way as well. And this honestly, this is the biggest reminder to me of that hilarious scene in Tim Burton's film Ed Wood, where you're looking at all the animal stock footage, and he's talking about how easy it would be to construct a film out of all this stuff, and it's like, well, here it is, man. Here's a big chunk of this movie where we're getting across this idea using nothing but animal stock footage.
Yeah, if they had a load of stock footage from a circus, they would have had a plot line about how the magnetism was affecting the clowns or something. Yeah. It's just it's pretty tenuous. But I mean, they do say that animals are sensitive to earthquakes, so I suppose we have to give them some slack there. But yeah, it's pretty funny. It's so then a large sphere appears in the sky, surrounded by a gigantic halo in the hours before sundown. And this is where we get Bava's really cheap special effect of just basically holding a studio light behind a sheet and then projecting photos of cities onto the other side. But it works. It's quite effective. It looks like we're getting mini what's the word? It's gone out of my head. What do you call it when the moon goes in front of the sun?
Oh, an eclipse.
Eclipses. Thank you. Sorry, what happened to me there?
I wondered what the hell you were searching for there. Yeah,
it's almost like I was on that rocket with John there. My brain just stopped working. Yeah, so it looks like there's an eclipse going on. There's something weird in the atmosphere. In time, other bright spheres are manifest in the sky. As the time of ultimate collision draws near, the governments of the world force their populations into subterranean shelters. And this is where we get more great stock footage of the military. Some of this stock footage actually I felt was perhaps a little bit uncomfortable because some of it looked like it was from the war maybe, but we've got like the police rounding people up. We've got hundreds of people running afraid from stuff. And because that all of that is real, that felt a bit like those people that we're seeing in that footage are actually properly having a horrible time. They're not acting. So that, I don't know what you thought, but that just made me think, oh,
I'll be honest,
that's a bit much.
I only was thinking about that kind of a little after the footage is on screen, because at the time I'm not thinking, oh, that's stock footage. Oh my goodness, that means that's probably those cops are really menacing those people instead of supposedly helping them. But a minute or so clicks by and you're like, oh yeah, that has to have been that. There's no way they spent the money to stage that because there are far too many people in those shots. So yeah.
Yeah, no, the only actual real life footage, which I'm assuming they shot somewhere quite close to the studio, probably. is we see a bunch of local people having to get to a shelter. I think the idea is that this shelter is on the military base or whatever kind of base they're on, because John's wife Mary and his son, they're sent to go and get into the shelter, but we don't even see them actually going into a shelter. It looks more like they're just standing around under some railway arches.
Yeah,
but I don't know if we're supposed to assume that's underground.
It would have been much more effective if they, not that they needed to really, but if they wanted it to just to feel more like some kind of, I'm assuming fallout shelter, for lack of a better design, then they needed to be in a cramped room where we could see the roof, the ceiling, while we're in the room, to kind of give you that idea of being in an enclosed space. But I don't think I don't think they had a spot where they could do that. So yeah.
No, but that sequence is quite nicely lit. To be fair, I do like the lighting there; it's quite atmospheric. But yeah, it does look more like they're in a train station.
Well, this is a good point. You talk about the lighting, and I agree with you. One of the reasons why I would love to see a better looking print of this is that knowing a little bit about the photographic tricks that Bava was a master of in black and white cinema. This is, of course, a black and white film, folks. In case you had any, in case we had made that clear. Some of the tricks he used to get some really interesting effects, and some of them take place when we're watching the possibly robotic actor in the capsule before he jettisons and endangers the entire world, is because it's shot in black and white. If you use different colored gels over essentially kind of project different colors over someone's face or over an image on black and white film, it changes the texture and the way it looks within those black and white and shades of gray on film stock. So you can get some really interesting effects that give you an otherworldly feel, or just the look of something that isn't earthly in a certain way, which is very exactly the kind of thing that you're aiming for in a fantasy or a science fiction movie.
Yeah,
and
that's something that he did particularly in I Vampiri.
And so there's a little bit of that going on in this movie, and he of course he was also a master of using his lighting to such an effect that you could make a place look larger or smaller or more interesting just by virtue of where he placed the lights and how he put both the actors and different little pieces of set design within the image. And so you do get a little bit of that in this movie. And therefore, I would love to see a really sharp looking print of this that no one's ever going to probably spend the money to create. But the beauty of the real joys for a fan of Bava is just looking for those small elements within the images he's putting on screen here that tie you back to stuff that he would do or continue to do, I should say, in later films that you already know better. So,
yeah, definitely. Of course, going to the shelters turns out to not be very helpful because the Earth is now heating up. I didn't quite entirely understand why the meteor approaching the Earth is causing the Earth to now get really hot, but spontaneous combustions are breaking out all over the Earth, causing everybody to flee the shelters, and they start fighting each other and rioting. And this bit reminded me a little bit of The Day the Earth Caught Fire. Do you know that film, the British science fiction film? Well, and that one is about...
I'm sorry, but that's the movie with the similar title that that made me think that I had already seen this movie.
Oh, see, yeah. Because that one is also sort of nuclear, atomic based, but that one's about nuclear bombs that had exploded, and it's causing the Earth to now shift off its axis and start moving closer to the sun, and the Earth is getting hotter and hotter. And this bit of the film kind of reminded me of that for some reason the meteor and getting closer and the magnetism. I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but I'm not 100% convinced that the science in this film really holds up.
Okay, let's be clear. I'm pretty sure that 90 to 99% of the science presented in this movie is complete crap. there are times when I honestly there's a string of about 3 sentences that one of the international group of scientists slings out at a certain point in the movie, where I literally stopped the movie, turned to my beloved Beth on the couch next to me, and went, not one word of that made sense. And she's nodding her head and going, that was all gibberish. Maybe it didn't feel that way in 1958, but I'm telling you right now, in 2021, all of those words in that combination do constitute an English sentence or 3, but they do not make any sense.
No. So poor old John at this point, he's feeling really guilty because he forgot to switch the thing off, and it's just kind of all his fault. And somebody's having a conversation in the room that they're all in, and mentions something to do with atomic power or nuclear power or something. But then the little light bulb goes on over his head, or maybe just a little fire catching fire on his head. But anyway, this inspiration hits him that, of course, we'll use our own atomic weapons to save the day. So this ties in with the whole. Which is the one with Elijah Wood? It's not Armageddon. It was the other one. Was that one called?
Wood. Oh, you're thinking about Deep Impact.
Deep Impact, yeah, that's the one.
Well, here's where we should show. We're going to show our ages here, relatively. Let me tell you right now, my friend. The movie this reminds me of is a little crappy disaster film from the late '70s called Meteor. Starring Sean Connery and a lot of other actors. It's
that's what it said on the poster, isn't it?
That's pretty much the tagline. Sean Connery and a bunch of other actors face near destruction at the hands of Meteor, and it's a very similar thing. The real change for 1979, which is when I think the movie was made, is that the missiles that are used to try to blast the meteor into dust are actually already space-based. They're already in orbit.
That's handy.
Yeah, exactly. And so don't get me wrong. If you really want to have some fun, seeking out Meteor and imbibing enough alcohol or whatever substance of your choice would help you to enjoy a film that isn't particularly perfect. It could be an evening of fun, but it will remind you in some ways of exactly what this film is, because there's only so many variations you can put on this stuff. And it coming at the end of the 70s, it's very much in the vein of your standard disaster film, which, let's be honest, this is an early disaster. This is a 1958 disaster film.
Yeah, this is where they're going to get rid of all the nuclear weapons in one go, basically. They decide that they realize what they need to do is every country in the world to fire its nuclear missiles at the meteor. And somebody says, but we're going to let loads of radiation out into the atmosphere. And then another scientist is like, don't worry, it'll all just get dispersed into the atmosphere. It'll be totally fine.
I know. There's no one.
He's got his fingers crossed behind his back there, I think.
Yeah. He's literally that second getting on the phone and making arrangements to buy every bit of bunker material he can possibly find.
Yeah, but I think this is a very optimistic film in terms of global politics, because it takes no time at all. Well, yeah, it takes no time at all to get the whole world ready. All of their missiles are apparently already pointing in the sky. It doesn't take much to just get them to go. All they need is the maths. All they need is the coordinates. They can't just point it at the giant rock in the sky. You think that'd be quite easy, but no. They've got to get. They need Katie and her overheating computer. Yeah, her overheating supercomputer to make every single calculation, so they can then fire their rockets at this thing. So that's pretty much the plan.
Well, and of course, I will say this: the idea that the Katie run supercomputer that they have there in Australia to do all the calculations. That's one of the things about 1958 that feels very, very scientifically realistic, because I don't know that anywhere else in the world would have had a computer of that size and magnitude that actually was built to compute all of this stuff. So at least that is one area of scientific accuracy that I think kind of bears up under scrutiny.
Yeah, and I love how the computer is just kind of giving its output on little dot matrix printer type thing, or whatever they would have had in 1958. But I'm sure it seemed very modern and futuristic at the time. But yeah, they're having problems as well because the obviously the world is heating up, but heat will make the computer not work, and so they've got to make sure the aircon is working. All these things going on. I'm not going to say more really, other than it's okay, the dog is fine, so you don't need to worry about the dog. But I'm not going to say whether or not their plan works, although you can probably guess, because this is that kind of film, whether their plan is going to work or not. But there are some quite good scenes in the last few minutes as to getting the calculations, how they're coping with all the action. People are going a bit mad in the heat.
And actually, that stuff at the end where one of the scientists has suddenly found religion and loses his mind and is causing problems of his own. Yeah,
he sees this as the second coming or something is happening.
That is actually some of the more interesting stuff in the movie.
Yeah,
which is one of the reasons. There's a number of reasons why I don't, I don't consider this a bad movie. It's just it's not nearly as good as it should have been, and it's a little too inert. But I have to say, some of that stuff in the final few minutes where everything is coming to a boil is pretty darn interesting. So
we've got some good action going on, and some more great Bava special effects, and a load of really good stock footage. They seem to have found every single clip that existed of missiles taking off.
Yeah,
and put them all into the movie. So that, from a historical point of view, that's really interesting. I was reading somewhere that said that in those days most rocket tests ended in failure with the rockets blowing up on the platform. So to have footage of all of these rockets actually taking off was quite impressive, because more often than not they just blew up. So yeah, from a sort of, if you're interested in the history of missiles, then there's something in there for you as well. But I enjoyed this movie, although it is cliched in lots of ways. The fact that it's an industry that wasn't previously making this kind of film, and they're having a go. They're looking, again, this is classic Italian cinema, and we'll talk about this all the time. They're looking at what's doing really well overseas and thinking, well, let's have a go at doing that ourselves. And this film feels like it would have fitted in perfectly in a Hollywood studio. There are plenty of films that are very, sort of similar in tone or style and whatever. But this is a relatively young film industry, still recovering after decades of fascism and World War II and all of that stuff. And they're trying something pretty much for the first time. So although it's not brilliant, I think it's still quite an impressive piece of work for what it is.
I agree. I find it an interesting curio, not necessarily a great film by any stretch, but there are some interesting things in it. One thing I would like to point out, and this is something that might be distracting to someone who's coming to this film after being really familiar with a lot of different Italian or European exploitation films made over the next couple of decades. There's one actor in the movie who's going to stand out for you, because you're going to...
I nearly forgot.
Yeah,
yes.
You're going to know immediately, oh, I know this guy. I know this guy's face. And I guess I cannot trick you into saying this guy's name, so I'm going to try to give it a shot here. Is it Giacomo Rossi Stewart?
Yeah, I think we can say that. And what's interesting is
that, but it sounds terrible. But
I think it would probably say Giacomo.
Giacomo.
I think it's a Giacomo.
Okay. Cool.
I think.
So
but just because I've been trying to teach myself Italian doesn't mean I know what I'm doing. But his character's name is Stuart. I nearly forgot him. He's not even in the credits.
No, he's not.
So I think he must have been fairly young at this point. It's quite early in his career.
Yeah.
But yeah, as soon as you see him, you're like, oh, it's that guy. It's so nice to see him.
And the thing is, like I say, he pops up in so many movies over the years. Death Smiles on a Murderer, Crimes of the Black Cat in the 70s. He's in The Night Evelyn Came Out of the Grave. He's in.
Well, for me, it's The Last Man on Earth. That's
Yeah.
always the film I think of when I see him.
He's the taunting undead villain.
Yeah.
In that film with Vincent Price.
Yeah.
And he's amazing. Yeah.
And of course, he was in Kaltiki, and he's also in Kill Baby Kill. I think he's the star of that one.
Yeah, which
So
means
he
that
did a
he
few-
worked with Bava several times over the years.
And we're going to be talking about him again in a couple of weeks because he's also in Wild Wild Planet,
Yes, indeed.
which is exciting.
Well, he's in he's in two.
or
Of
is
them.
he-
He's also in War Between
he's
the
in-
Planets, and
Yeah, I know he's in some of those. They all blend into one in my head, but yeah, he's definitely that was really fun to see him in there. I think he's the only actor that I properly recognized. So yeah, thank you. I'd forgotten to mention him, but yeah, you're right.
But I think he's great, and even in a small role, he stands out. And I can't figure out if he stands out because I've seen him in so many movies, or if he stands out because he has such an interesting looking face. I mean, he was a good looking man who really he was actually a pretty effective actor, no matter how small the role. And it is weird that he's in the entire movie and he's not even credited. It's bizarre.
Yeah, he's got a main part.
Yeah.
Although towards the end, it mainly just involves him looking at, talking on the radio, and then he doesn't really get. I suppose the thing with him is that although he's on screen quite a lot, he doesn't really have a life of his own. He's just one of the guys in the room on the radio doing the communications. But
That's true.
But he does have. Yeah, he's got presence. Like he's good, and it's. Yeah, it was nice to see him in here. I don't know, the rest of the cast I wasn't particularly familiar with. Obviously, Paul Heusch has been in a couple of things that I recognise, but he's not a face that I particularly knew. Ivo Garani, who's in the film.
He's someone, if you go a little deeper, he's someone that you probably seen in a lot of movies, whether you recognize him or not. Yeah, because he also worked with
did
Bava
other
in
stuff.
a few other films, like Black Sunday and a few others. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a few names in here of people who are going to go on to do more in this world, which is cool. But I think this is definitely a film that's worth looking out for if you're interested in this stuff, which is presumably you are if you're listening. And it is currently just streaming very easily to find online. I'll put a link to the film in the show notes.
I think that a good way to wrap it up is kind of the way that I think Matt Blake wraps it up in his book Science Fiction Italian Style. He has a quote here. It's a review for La Stampa covering a TV screening in 1965, and the quote is a curious affair, even if the events depicted sometimes smack of naivete and the sets are barely able to hide the fact that they're made out of paper mache. This Italo-French co-production has some original elements that still hold up, but the attempts to generate suspense fail, and in more than one sequence the science fiction loses track of reality. Unquote. That's kind of my feelings on the subject. I think it's interesting, especially from an historical standpoint, and this guy kind of hit it on the head just 7 years after the movie was made.
Yeah, that seems fair. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's. Well, thank you for taking the time to watch this film. It sounds like you watched it twice, which is particularly impressive.
The second time through was a little quicker. I won't say that I sped the film up, but you can surmise what you wish.
Okay. Yes. Fair enough. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for listening and for joining us as we start to take a look at these Italian space movies. Next time, we're going to be talking about the Antonio Margheriti film, Assignment Outer Space. Rod, thank you, and we'll see you all soon.
Excellent. Glad to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Bye.
Bye.